Welcome to the Q&A Cafe, recording here today at the DC Cable Studios, overlooking the railroad tracks. It's actually a pretty wonderful view, and thank you for joining us. This is a very special Q&A for me because my guest is DC Police Chief Peter Newsham.
Morning.
Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, whenever you're watching. And I want to read something from a book I actually wrote about my time owning Nathan's, but you'll appreciate why I'm reading this.
Okay.
It says, days later, while driving toward downtown in the early afternoon, I got a panic call from a member of Nathan's staff. Carol, you've got to get here. Manhole covers are exploding up and down M Street. They've shut us down. There are fire engines and cops everywhere. I made a U-turn. I raced back there. I had to park. There were police cars, yellow tape, fire engines, all around Nathan's at Wisconsin and M. And I write, a group of police officers stood in the middle of the intersection outside Nathan's front doors. Their shirts and hats carried a lot of gold braid. They had to be the brass, and I headed their way. The man in charge was a tall, handsome, dark-haired officer named Peter Newsham, the commander for the 2nd District, a region that included the White House, Georgetown, and parts of upper Northwest D.C. You can't be here, he said. We're closing the whole block. Your staff has been evacuated. You've got to go. I sputtered, but I need. He'd have none of it. You've got to go. You cannot be here. It's not safe. He pointed to a restaurant a few hundred yards away and said, you'll find your staff there. I started stammering again. But, he pointed and said, go. And that was how we first met. Do you remember that day?
I remember the circumstance. I definitely remember the manhole covers exploding.
What in police work prepares an officer for manhole covers exploding in the streets?
One of the things you see in policing is, and I was actually thinking about this recently, is you come in every single day and you really have no idea what's going to happen. And over a course of time, when you do this long enough, regardless of what happens, you just got to remember you got to keep your head. And really the goal is to make sure that people are safe. And if you can keep that in mind, regardless of what happens, you can have pretty good outcomes most of the time. You're
standing in the middle of an intersection, though, and you don't know where it's going to come from. I mean, just as a business owner at the time, as I mentioned, I owned Nathan's. I think this was 2000 or 2001. It was before 9/11, so we weren't in that conditioned mindset yet that when anything happened, we thought it was terrorism. We sort of knew this was exactly.
That's probably true, right?
And because that changed everything after 9/11. If that had happened after 9/11,
it probably would have.
The whole city would have been shut down.
National attention.
Perhaps, well, as it was, a lot of national attention was brought to it because it had, infrastructures hadn't started blowing up all over the country. Since then, it has happened in other cities. But at the time, you were running the 2nd District, and I was owning Nathan's. And so it was a very nice friendship that you want to be friends with the cops when you own a bar.
Probably a good idea.
Yes, exactly. Which, I want to go back then and talk a little bit more about you because I think a lot of people see the chief of police on TV a lot and in the newspapers, but it's almost always at a crime scene and it's talking about a crime scene. Or he's testifying before the city council, asking for money, asking for help, asking for whatever. But I don't know that very often people get to know much about you, where you came from, why you decided to go into police work. So I'd like to talk about that for a little bit.
Sure.
You grew up in Massachusetts.
I did, in a place called Weymouth, Massachusetts.
Is that
it's kind of a...
Is it on the water?
It's south of Boston, about 15 minutes. It's between Boston and Cape Cod. Mm-hmm. It was a pretty big town. Not a lot to say about Weymouth, Massachusetts. I met some of my dearest friends that I have in my life at that time in my life. Actually, because I moved when we went to high school. So these are people that I met when I was in junior high, and they're my friends to this very day. A good group of young people at the time, and we've become very close friends over the years.
What did your parents do? Were you in a big family?
A very big family. My mom raised 8 of us.
Peter.
Yes, she has about 30 grandchildren and about
oh my God.
9 great-grandchildren. I just got to see my mom recently, which was great. My dad worked for the power company. He started as a bricklayer. And when he was very proud of this, when he retired, he was a vice president for New England Light and Power. So he was very proud of the way that he rose from, he went to school later in life. And I actually followed a similar path in my lifetime.
With your education.
I didn't end up going to law school. I graduated from law school in 2000, so I was on the police department at the time.
In a way, once you knew what you were going to do with the law degree.
I would say, yeah, at that point in my career, to be quite honest with you, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with the law degree, but I know that I had always said that I was going to go to law school, so it was one of those things that I had on my accomplishment list that I had not accomplished, and I felt like I needed to. And it was a great experience. It really was. I really enjoyed it. Going at an older stage of life was, I think, more valuable than if I had gone as a kid.
Because you're actually paying attention.
You're paying attention.
Putting some life experiences to what you're learning.
Exactly, and that was kind of the great thing about my class, too, and my classmates. We were all working, and we all had families, and we all had very similar experiences, and it was really, really an excellent experience. I really had a great time the 4 years. A lot of work involved.
Because you were also working.
I was working. I was raising 2 young kids. So it was. But I tell everybody on the police department, particularly my young managers, that if I can do it, you can do it. I'm not the brightest bulb on the tree. It's just a matter of doing the work.
Do you have a program that accommodates the time needed for an officer to go back to school? We
do. We try to accommodate that type of thing because the future of the police department is our current middle managers and our young leaders today. So we want to make sure if they're inclined to go out there and better themselves, that we can somehow accommodate that.
But back to Massachusetts. Did you go to college there?
I did. Initially I went to a state school the first 2 years, and then I went to Holy Cross after that, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts.
What did you think you were going to do?
I was young. I had no idea.
You had no idea.
I was, late teens, early 20s. Most kids that I talk to today tell me the same thing. I think more kids don't know what they want to do than kids who know what they do. When you find a kid who knows what they do, you're like, oh, that's fantastic. But I do run into a lot of kids who say, I have no idea what I want to do. And I always tell kids that are in that position, keep moving forward. It doesn't matter what you select as your major in college. Take something. If you haven't gone to college, make sure you go to college. Keep moving in a forward direction, and sooner or later you'll figure it out.
What did you think of cops when you were young? Did you get in trouble? Were you a good guy, bad guy?
We had,
mischief?
I think there was some mischief in my early teen years. I don't think that's uncommon for most teen boys. We had some run-ins with the police, and I actually came across some really good ones, and I also came across some really bad ones. And I always tell people, young people in particular, you can learn just as much from a bad cop as you can from a good one, because what you learn from the bad cop is never to be like that.
And the bad is bad in their attitude toward?
The way they treat people.
Yeah.
Policing has evolved so much in the 28 years I've been doing it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, it used to be kind of an us versus them mentality. And one of the things, and the things that I really have learned in these 28 years is that without a relationship with the community, a police department's not going to be effective. There's only so many police you can have out there looking and paying attention to what's going on. When I came here in 1989 and 1990, very few people in the city that I came in contact with were inclined to cooperate with the police department. Police department had a really bad reputation. We weren't trusted. We were looked at like we had that us versus them mentality, and all of that, I think, and crime was really bad. You would think that folks would want
one of the worst periods
to have that relationship with the police department, and what I have learned over the years that's crucial to being successful in policing. When people, and trust is really built through legitimacy, and so when I say being legitimate is not easy. In this profession. Being legitimate requires extremely hard work every single day. Legitimacy is being responsive when somebody contacts you. You got to get back to them. You know, people generally, they may not like the answer that you give them, but if you don't get back to them, now you've really created a bad relationship. I know that there are people out there that I have dealt with who I have given them answers that they didn't want to hear, but they'll be like, at least the guy got back to me. You know, and
email
I think,
has compounded that, though.
yeah.
And on the one hand, email makes it easier for people to ask something of you, but there can be so much of it, and you can be up half the night trying to.
You can. And that's what I mean. It's hard work.
But at least it's there.
Yeah, and I got to say, that's one of the things I feel very comfortable with our agency here in Washington, D.C. I believe that our people, by and large, are very responsive to the concerns of the community.
One more thing about when you were growing up. Were there beat cops? I mean, did you see a cop every day? Did you have a sense they were in your neighborhood?
No, I don't think that was the state of affairs when I was growing up. You would see them, you know, whenever something bad happened, you'd see the police.
Then they'd show up. What planted the desire in you? What got your attention about policing as a profession?
I've had family members that were in policing. I have an uncle who was a police officer for over 30 years in Providence. I have another uncle who actually was the chief of police in Providence for a few years. I have aunts that worked for the police department.
Okay, so it was in the family.
It's definitely in the family.
So it was always there.
It was.
Were you rejecting it or thinking about it early on?
Never really thought about it, to be quite honest with you. I came down to Washington, D.C. after I graduated with a political science degree to look for jobs on Capitol Hill. You know, kind of seemed like the right thing to do. Yeah. And they were hiring a bunch of police officers at the time. If you remember, they had a huge
D.C. police.
D.C. police. And so I said,
Who was chief then?
Who was chief? Oh my goodness, was it?
I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
It could have been Forward, or it might have been Turner at the time.
My first D.C. police chief was Jerry Wilson.
Yeah.
I remember I was a young reporter, and it was during all the anti-war protests, and
it was probably Turner.
Yeah, I don't even know if Jerry Wilson's still alive today, but it would be interesting, you know, just to talk to him now, looking back, because those anti-war demonstrations, nothing like it has. We've had demonstrations in the city, as you know, but these were such overwhelming, and the police force of D.C. was so much on the spot for how they handled it, and they were commended. Back then. You
know, we have actually had a really good reputation with handling large-scale demonstrations here in the city, and we've learned along the way. You know, we've had some growing pains. We've had some suits filed against us by protesters and demonstrators. It made us a better agency. You know, and that's part of the evolution of policing. You just try to get better. Every time you do something wrong, you try and get better.
When you decided to apply for this job, you knew it, because it was in your family, you knew what you were getting into. Were you committed to it then? Or were you thinking, I'll try this out? I
can tell you, once I walked in the door, I loved it from the very beginning.
Really?
I really enjoyed my classmates in the academy. It was just fun to me. And
where is the academy in D.C.?
It's over in Southwest D.C., right off of 295. You can actually see most people see the fire academy if you look off to the right, because they have that building they use for training their firefighters. But the police academy is set just a little bit further back. And it's the same one you went to? It stayed the same all these years? It is, yeah. And I can tell you, you know, that part of it was fun because I really enjoyed the people in my class that I got to, you know, go through the academy with. You develop a camaraderie with those folks. But when I got out onto the streets, I ended up starting in the 6th District.
Tough district.
Yeah, I worked for a guy by the name of Wilson over there who was the commander. Really good man. And I just, from day one, it was a blast. I really enjoyed the work. What did you like best? I mean, what was it that spoke to you as making you feel? Working with the people, you know what I mean? Working with the people on the job, working with the people on the streets. There were, like I said, this was a very violent time in the district's history. And there were a lot of people that were afraid of what was going on. And those folks really kind of looked to the police to be the good guy. And I enjoyed playing that role. You know, when people were under these very difficult circumstances, we could come up and help them out. Most of the times we could help them out, and I felt really good about that.
They write about you often as if your career was a skyrocket. You know, like you joined the force and then a week later you were a district commander. But it doesn't happen ever quite that fast.
No, the funny thing too is when I first took the sergeant's promotional exam, I don't even know why I took it, because I was really enjoying what I was doing. I was working over in a vice unit over in the 6th District, and I loved work. I loved going to work every day. Matter of fact, I would.
Did you ever do any plainclothes work or anything?
A little bit. You know, the vice unit, we were always in plain clothes. I did a couple of undercover things when I was in that unit, but you know, it was. You know, that time in my career, I was very happy at what I was doing, and I don't even remember why I took the sergeant's exam. And I remember I think.
Well, your philosophy was working for you.
Maybe,
yeah.
And
improve yourself.
I remember calling after I had taken the exam. Was somewhere, I don't remember where I was, but I called the station, and the way that they assign your grades is they give you like a 4-digit number, and you give the person the number, and they can tell you how you did on the exam. And they told me I was like in the top 2 or 3 of the people, and I was astonished that I had done that well, because I didn't really go in there, you know, really kind of committed to taking it. So I was very, you know, very happy that I had done that well. I guess I was like, I guess I'll be a sergeant. And then being a sergeant was just as great of an experience as being an officer. I went over to the 7th District to be a sergeant. You know, as I worked over there, I worked for a guy by the name of Winston Robinson, who was a committed career police official. I really enjoyed working for him, and what happened is he ended up assigning me the rookies that came in. So as the new people came in, they were all assigned to me and another sergeant who worked there at the time, and that was great. I mean, I just had more fun than you can even begin to imagine.
Did you have a mentor at this time? Was there somebody who was...
Ooh, did I have a mentor at this time? That's a good question. You know, I had, when I was going through the promotional process from sergeant to lieutenant to captain, it's a very competitive process. And there were a couple of folks, one of them by the name of Kathy Lanier, who we spent a lot of time talking about the promotional process. And, you know, if you were...
And what was she doing then?
We got promoted at the same,
so you were
almost at the same time. We were in different parts of the city, you know, but we got.
But you were sort of in the same class.
Essentially on the same track. And whenever we were competing in the promotional exams, her and a guy by the name of Mike Anzalo, who's an assistant chief now, we're always in 1, 2, and 3. We all changed positions. You know, if you listen to Kathy tell the story, I can call her Kathy now, now that she's not the chief. Yeah. You listen to her tell the story. She was #1 every time. I don't know if that's true. It could very well be, but we were in very close, very close competition. But you know, if you ask me throughout my career, because I spent a lot of time as an assistant chief, there's a couple of people that I look to as people that I really admired and appreciated their work, and I learned a lot from. One of them would be Charles Ramsey, when he was the chief of police there, and the second one would be Kathy Lanier.
Do you keep in touch with both to this day?
I do. Kathy, I'll talk about her. She really surprised me. When she became the chief of police, she was put in a very difficult position because she leapfrogged a lot of people of higher rank. And she went into that job, and let me tell you what, that's a daunting thing for a commander to do. And for the way that she did it, and this is when I tell the story, she never blinked. She never blinked. She just looked forward. She was committed, and she worked very hard.
She was the biggest survivor of the Fenty administration when you
think
about it.
She worked very hard every single day, and her attention to detail is the thing that I really learned from her. You got to really look at things in detail and figure them out before you make any decisions where you're going to go with them.
You became a sergeant, and you're in the 7th District. When did you first have to start dealing with politics? Was it when you became a sergeant?
No,
not yet.
No, certainly. I would say, you know, the politics piece doesn't really come into play until you get to maybe the commander level.
But you knew it was out there.
There's certainly a degree of politics in this.
You have to start meeting ANC commissioners and
You do.
local activists, and
do.
you have to start dealing with that.
Yeah, and you find, there's two kinds of people that are involved in those roles in our city. And you have the people that are really committed to making their neighborhoods better. And then you have some people that are just in it for themselves. And you can quickly identify who's who. And I can tell you the people who are in it just for themselves, I don't really have a lot of time for them. The people who are committed to making their neighborhoods better, even if I disagree with them, I always admire what they're doing.
What's the step one takes to get from sergeant to commander to district commander?
Well, then you got to become a lieutenant and then a captain.
And
so there's a couple more promotional
where
exams.
Where did those stages happen for you? What wards?
I went over to Ward 5 as a lieutenant.
So now you've done 6 and 7, and you're going to 5.
I did.
As a lieutenant.
I did. And then when I got promoted to captain, I went back to the 6th District. Worked for a guy, and I when I was talking about mentors, I worked for a guy by the name of Rodney Monroe, who ended up being a chief in Georgia and then in Charlotte, and he's since retired. But that was a guy that taught me a lot when I went over there as a captain about being a command official.
By the time you're a captain, how long have you been on the force?
I would think I was a captain in '97, so that's 9 years.
9 years.
Yeah.
And by now you know this is your career. This is what you're going to do. It's going to be your life.
I think it looked that way at that point. Yeah.
And coming to the 2nd District, what was that like for you? It's so different. I mean, it's that other dimension of the city. You have worked in the least leafy and the most leafy wards of the city. And yet, each in its own unique way has personalities and issues you have to deal with. You come to the 2nd District, as I said in my book, it's Georgetown, it's the White House, it's a whole new set of personalities, and it is very political.
It's a lot different. It was funny. I tell this story to people all the time because, like I said, I started in 6, went to 7, went to 5, and then I went back to 6D. And the way that Chief Ramsey used to promote people is he would send them a text message the night before and say, somebody would send from the chief's office, you have to be in the chief's office tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And I was a captain, and so that meant one of two things. Either I did something really good or so I did something really bad.
There was no clue, right?
No idea why I was going. I went into the office, and Chief Ramsey was there, and Mike Fitzgerald, who was the executive assistant chief. And he shook my hand and he said, you're going to be the commander of the 2nd District. I was like, this is very exciting. This is a big step forward in my career. I said, where is it?
That's great.
So I headed up to the 2nd District. And
it's new location because it actually used to be literally in Georgetown. And they closed that and then they moved it up to Tenley where you had your office.
Yep. So I was up there.
And but did you like it?
I tell you what I learned from being the commander in 2D is that the policing challenges are just as challenging in the 2nd District, and the people who live and work in the 2nd District are just as committed about their policing as anywhere else that I had been in the city.
Don't you get a little more though of the "Do you know who I am"?
You get some of that. I don't think I've ever
That's got to be a huge step in the development of a police chief in the nation's capital. Learning how to navigate the "Do you know who I am"?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
There's some of that, but I think that, it's just a matter when whoever you're dealing with at any given time, it's really about listening to what their concerns are.
Yeah,
and seeing if there's something that you can legitimately do for them as their commander. In some cases I could do things, that were within my control, and in some cases I couldn't. And I always found that the best way to deal with anybody, regardless of who they were, is to tell them the truth. This is what I can do and most of the people that you deal with, whether it be in 2D or 6D or 70, anywhere in the city, they've dealt with district commanders before. You figure that out pretty quickly, that you're no different than the last 2 or 3 that they dealt with. So I always said, I'm not going to come in here and promise them something that I can't do. If there's something I can do and it's within my area of responsibility, that's what we're here for. That's what we should be doing.
Was the 2nd District the first time you had to really start intersecting in earnest with the federal security services like the Secret Service and the State Department security and just all those levels of federal?
There was definitely more of that as a commander, and that's not 2D specific. Any of our commanders now, and policing has changed, like you said, since September 11th. But at that level of the agency, you start to intersect with a lot of the federal partners that we have here in the city. And I can tell you one of the things that I have seen, particularly in the last, say, 7 or 8 years, is that relationship has gotten much better than it ever was before. That relationship used to be a little bit tense years ago. But now that relationship, like this past inauguration, the relationships, because we work together so much all the time, because of all the homeland security issues that we face, I know all the leadership of all the federal agencies by first name. I have their phone numbers in my phone. We meet, probably at least 2 or 3 times a month.
Do you have a unique perspective on the reports that came out that the Secret Service was close to busting its budget on protecting the first family?
I think there were some concerns about that early on, and I think it's really from the way I understand it, it's because of the size of the family.
Yeah.
You're dealing with, I think the Obamas, you were dealing with a husband and a wife and 2 small children,
Yeah.
which is
who lived at the White House.
very easy to protect a very small, and now you're talking about a very large family with adults who are traveling the world. It's adults with means. So I think there was a concern up front that this was going to be expensive for the Secret Service.
Does that impact the DC police too, the size of the family?
No, not really, not at all. Most of the, anything that we do with the federal government, we get reimbursed for, so it doesn't impact staffing. That's really a good point that a lot of people in our community don't understand. The reason it doesn't impact our staffing is because we facilitate that with overtime, and then the federal government reimburses us for us. So we're not taking any of our police officers off the street to do that work.
The inauguration, you were interim chief during the inauguration. Did you feel at any time like you were being tested?
Was I being tested? I don't know. I tell you what, I was very honored that the mayor had asked me to be the interim chief, and I thought that I could do this job. I thought I was very well prepared because of my experience here at MPD. And so I really wasn't that worried about whether or not I got the job. I am eligible to retire, so financially it wasn't a concern to me whether or not I got the job. And so I knew this was an important role that we had to play in our city to make sure that this was a successful event. And I got to say, I was very proud of the way that our agency responded. If you remember, we had the inauguration, which was very successful by all accounts. And then the very next day, we had the Women's March on Washington, which was huge.
Yes,
and that was a huge
that was
event.
an old school massive demonstration.
And it was really fun. And our police officers got a lot of accolades for the way they facilitated that huge group that came to our city. And it was really, there's a couple of things you reflect back on your career that were really, really fun to be a part of. Obama's first inauguration, the amount of people that came to the city.
Where were you that day?
I was down on the mall for the swearing in. One of the things that people forget is that after the swearing in, a lot of the crowds left. There weren't as many people for the parade. It was very cold. There weren't as many people that stuck around for the parade as they normally do.
Yeah.
But being down in that crowd is something I will never forget. And to know that, MPD played a role in facilitating that crowd to come into Washington, D.C., to come in, participate in a historic event, and to successfully leave. I think that was something, that's one of the things our agency is very proud of. And then that Women's March on Washington, that was probably the second biggest event that I've seen here in my career.
And the accolades you got for that, I suppose, balanced the criticisms you got for the day before.
Yeah, I think, some of the criticism that we got during the inauguration, I think a lot of people have gained a little perspective on that. A lot of people saw on the news exactly what our police department was dealing with. I had 6 police officers that went to the hospital. One of them was knocked unconscious because somebody threw a piece of steel at his head, which made a dent in his helmet and knocked him unconscious. None of the folks that we arrested were injured. We were facing a very dynamic situation where we had to restore order quickly, and I think we did it in a very noble fashion.
Just to date myself, I remember covering, I guess it was the May Day demonstration in 1970, and that's when the DC police arrested thousands of people and put them in the armory. And I was in the armory with them. Not the armory. It was it's where the Beatles played. What's the
RFK?
Uline Center? No,
Oh, okay.
the Uline. They put them inside the. It's got another name that it had after that, after the Uline Center. But the big arena where the Beatles played, and they filled that up with people who'd been arrested. They also had them in pens. In fenced pens. I mean, I'm not going to revisit all the ways that people have been arrested over the years and how they're dealt with, but there is never really a full upside, I suppose.
I agree.
You just got to do it. You've got to do your job, and then you got to take the heat.
And the other thing too that I think people have really come to know about the inauguration is that we went out before the inauguration. I personally went out and was on local and every single national TV broadcast, and I said, listen, here's what's going on Inauguration Day. We welcome you to our city like we always do to come here and peacefully demonstrate. But if you come here and break the law, we're going to have to respond accordingly, and I think we did that.
This is a completely random question, but we were talking about the motorcades and the federal working with the feds. How do you learn to drive in a motorcade? How do you learn to do that?
Oh, we train our folks how to do that.
Where do you go to learn it?
Yeah, we have training for our officers, particularly on the motorcycles.
Yeah, because people have been killed in motorcades.
Well, let me tell you,
it's not easy.
The training to ride those motors is some of the most difficult training that we have on the police department. We have people who come on the police department and they think they know how to ride a motorcycle, and they go to that training and they fail. Those folks are very skilled in the operation of those vehicles.
They're going fast.
There's some of that at times.
How do you train the guys who shut down the intersections and make us all mad at them to do it for the least amount of time? Do you know that you're like shutting people down while they're trying to get to work or get across the city?
Those are conversations that we have with our federal partners, and what I'm constantly suggesting to them is if we can't try to do these things at times when there isn't that volume of traffic on our streets, because it is frustrating.
Or if the president's not getting in the car for another 15 minutes,
I can tell you, I've been involved in that myself, and I
really?
I get the frustration. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I live in D.C. I know what that's like, especially if you have to be somewhere. It's very frustrating. But I think the people who live here take it very well. They've grown accustomed to it. And they try to avoid it.
It doesn't feel to me like President Trump goes around the city that much. But one thing I've noticed, and you would know, is in the last 5-6 years, there's much bigger motorcades for visiting dignitaries. They just sometimes, people will see a motorcade and they'll say, oh, that must be the president. Well, if it doesn't have certain components in the motorcade, you know it's not the president. And it's just some visiting head of state of maybe not even a known name or country, but he'll have a massive motorcade. Is that true that they've just been growing in size?
I haven't really noticed a noticeable difference. The one difference that I have noticed in Washington, D.C., probably in the last couple of years, is the streets do seem a little bit more congested.
You know why?
Well, there's a couple of
reasons. Because they're not riding the metro.
There could be some concerns with the metro, but I think also...
Aren't you glad you don't have to run that?
I think Mr. Wiedefeld's doing actually quite a good job over there. But, the other thing you got to keep in mind is our city is thriving right now.
Yeah.
People are coming to Washington, D.C. I mean, our population has increased close to 100,000 in the last 10 years. That's a lot of people that are coming. And now, not only do you have those people, but I was just reading in the paper, that we've had more visitors to our city than we have had in recent years. So, you know, the tourism industry is flourishing. You got people that want to come and live in Washington, D.C. The city is thriving. You know, traffic, somebody told me the other day, you know, perspective is everything. It's nice to be living in Washington, D.C. right now. And, you know, if you
How
gotta,
safe do you think
if you got to sit in traffic for a second, let's think about where we are and how lucky we are to be here.
How safe do you think people feel? How do you measure that? How do you know? I mean, crime is down, but do people feel safe?
Oh, is
it tangible?
Yeah, it's listening. And I can tell you, I was out at an event recently, and they had a couple of incidents over there, violent incidents. And, you know, I go out and I talk to folks and I tell them where we are with regards to crime. You know, last year we had the lowest number of reported violent crimes we've had in about a decade. So far this year, we have another 25% reduction in reported violent crimes. Those are very significant milestones to show people where we were and where we are. But if something happens in your community, people don't feel safe. You know, they just don't feel safe. And what I try to tell folks is that we're committed to finding who's responsible for the incident that occurred in your neighborhood, and that, you know, the last thing that we want to do in Washington, D.C. is to have people be afraid. So if you have incidents or if you have any information relative to something that happened in your community, please share it with us so we can get the bad actors out of our community. I think if we keep at it, we're going to get in a spot here in Washington, D.C. where we have very little violent crime.
And the thing we don't even like to talk about, because we've been lucky that we haven't had a terrorist attack here, certainly on your watch. And yet what we're seeing are these very random and almost impossible to predict incidents of trucks being driven into pedestrians. How would you handle, if you could do whatever you wanted, how would you prevent that from happening in the city? Is there any way?
I just got to let you know, we spend a lot of time discussing these things. And we have events in Washington, D.C. just about every day, and certainly every weekend. We're thinking about these types of things to make sure.
It can't be prevented, can it?
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily true, you know, and this is one of the things where we've become a little immune in a society. You know, you hear police and law enforcement going out there and saying, if you see something, say something. Let me tell you what, that's very effective.
Yeah?
These people who are involved in this activity generally will have some telltale signs before they're involved. And if you see that peculiar behavior, and that peculiar behavior could be a coworker, it could be a family member, it could be a neighbor. If you see that peculiar activity, you got to report it to law enforcement.
How many,
so they can take
how
a
many
look.
of those kinds of reports do you get?
We get a lot, and a lot of times we funnel them through our federal partners to chase them down. Some of them, you know, it ends up being nothing. In other cases, it's something of significance. I think in the United States, generally, law enforcement has done a pretty good job of intercepting some of these potentially bad actors from doing things. So I think if we, when I say we, not just us in law enforcement, but we and the community keep at it, we continue to be vigilant. Nobody likes to think about it, but vigilance is really important.
Does it keep you awake?
Sometimes. Yeah, it really does sometimes, thinking about things like that happening in our city, particularly when we have large events that are going to occur. I didn't sleep a lot the night before the inauguration.
Right.
I can tell you that.
Yeah, but it also feels like these things happen at the place you least expect it to occur, that almost seems to be part of the tactic, which is what makes it.
Could very well
It hasn't
be.
kept people off the streets or out of the movie theaters.
If you follow this stuff at all or you read about it, the people who are involved in this type of behavior are either one of two things. Either they have a mental health issue or they're sinister and they want to do harm to people. You know, so that's what they plan on doing, is doing it in a place where they can get away with it or do the most damage.
So we've been talking about your upbringing and how you came into policing and coming to Washington, your family growing up. You're now on your second marriage, right?
Yes.
And you're living. Are you living?
Now we're really getting personal.
Well, but people don't know much about you. You know, they know what they read, and then they don't know other dimensions. And do you live over by Yards Park? Did I recall
I do.
that?
Yeah.
And does that mean you're a baseball fan?
I'm a sport fan, regardless of the sport. I'm
Boston.
Well, I grew up in Massachusetts.
So you're a Patriots fan.
Well, let's not go too far. I have to say, I grew up in Boston, and so of course I'm a Red Sox, Celtics, Patriots, Bruins fan.
Okay.
Comes with the territory. It's a requirement.
It's a complicated time to be a Redskins fan anyway.
Anybody who's from the Northeast, up in New England in particular, it's almost required that you become. But nonetheless, the good thing about Washington, D.C. is that your football team is from the NFC.
So that makes, yeah.
That's my NFC team is the Redskins, and then my National League team is, over there.
I'm still going to let you off the hook if you're not a Redskins fan, because as I said, it's a complicated time to be a Redskins fan. But
This is a good time of year to be a Redskins fan.
Well, yeah,
right
it's
now.
true. Nothing's happened yet. Living by the ballpark, though, do you go to the games?
I do go to the games from time to time.
That's a great area over there.
Oh, it's fantastic.
It's been
love being over there.
It really given how long you've been in the city, you have been able firsthand to see the evolution of so many neighborhoods.
I have.
And how they've changed. And I imagine that impacts the way those neighborhoods are policed.
I don't
Because,
know.
well, the area around Yards Park used to be a cement factory. You didn't have to police that neighborhood,
But
really.
there were some clubs, if you remember,
There
that
were some
over
clubs,
there.
yeah. Well, they were very specific.
We spent a lot of time over there policing those clubs,
Yeah.
I can tell
but
you
now
that.
it's much more vast. You have government agencies, residents,
Oh, yeah.
kids, dogs, restaurants. You've got all of it going on.
And we're constantly taking a look at that. We go every year and we have strategic crime briefings where we're trying to look at where there's going to be population growth, if there's going to be buildings that are built, if there's going to, and we try to plan our police resources accordingly.
Our time's almost up, but there was one thing I really wanted to talk to you about. We're in a very difficult time in so many ways in the country. It's very divided. There is an awful lot of complicated and difficult discussions that are often directed toward policing. Policing has been given a lot of scrutiny. As you try to recruit younger people to come into a police force, do they come to you with their own questions about what policing means in this era? And how do you talk to them about why it's a career to choose and how to do it wisely?
Oh, I got to tell you, I think there's a couple things working against policing and getting people to come into this profession that weren't there when I joined. I don't believe that our institutions of higher learning are directing our young people into policing. And I think that, in fact, in some cases...
Because it's controversial? Because it's
Because
dangerous?
it's controversial. And I think there are maybe some generalities about policing that are being taught to our young people at these places that just aren't true. The people that I work with are very, very committed to helping people. And that's one of the things I talk to with young people all the time. And I think if people really knew what policing was all about, we'd have a lot more people coming and trying to join.
But are you seeing an alarming shortage of people wanting to come into the profession?
We're remaining pretty steady, but I am a little nervous that we won't be able to attract the kind of people that we want here, because I think so many people are being turned away or discouraged.
And you're a force with a good reputation.
We are. So I think
So if
in
you're
that
having a hard
regard,
time-
well, but in that regard, I think that's why we have a better chance than maybe some others to get some folks here. But I got to tell you, and I'll tell this to anybody who asks me, there's no more rewarding profession than being a police officer, and then particularly being a police officer in Washington, D.C. There's so many opportunities for a young person on this police department. And I always tell young people, too, if you don't like the police or if you don't like what the police represent, we're hiring. Come change and make us what you think we ought to be.
We met, as I mentioned, when the manhole covers were exploding, and you came and did the Q&A Cafe. You were probably, if not the first, the second person ever to do one of these in that little saloon at the corner of Wisconsin and M.
I remember that.
Like 20 years ago.
Yeah, I
Amazing.
remember. That was 20 years ago.
That was 20 years ago. Could have been 21 years ago. So thank you. Wasn't that bad, was it? We're done. You're like.
Oh, thank you very much.
See, it worked out.
Very nice.
So Peter, thank you
right.
very much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you, everyone. We'll see you at the next Q&A Cafe.